Hello, welcome to Process Guy. This is another tutorial on Bootstrap Forms allow you to style all the major form elements. And in this lesson, we will be looking at how to style input forms using form control, select, checkbox and radio boxes, how to combine input boxes together to create a very nice effect, floating labels like you have in your mobile devices, and form layouts, how to place those forms in a nice way such that it's appealing to the eye. You should be already familiar with forms because we've done this in HTML. I will just quickly bring out a form here that has our basic input text. So let's have this called form control. So this form control, we're going to be using it a lot. We are all familiar with this code, this piece of code, which shows the label and the input. We've not done anything special here. If you've gone through our HTML class, you will know that this is a way to show a form having a label and also a text box. This can be either any part of the form input control, but in this case we're just using text box for an example. So where does Bootstrap come in? As you will know, Bootstrap allows you to style each of these components, and the CSS class to use is very important, meaning you have to know those classes in order to style each part of this element. For the label, we have what we call form label. And what that does is to style the label itself. It gives the label its own styling, and that might not be visible for now. So let's go ahead and style the other part. But form label is used to style the label part of your input control. The other part we need to label is the text box itself. And this next class features on most of the controls that you'll be using. You'll be using it in most of the form control you'll be seeing going forward, and it's called form control. So immediately you apply that style, you will notice what happened to our text. Our text has this new look. So let me have for reference another one that doesn't have that control, so you see the difference from your normal form control and the one that Bootstrap has styled. So you could see the difference. The one up has some effect and also is nice looking. So let's go ahead and add more than one form so that we can have a good view of what's going on. I'm just gonna put this in a div so that I can provide some padding at the bottom. So I'm going to duplicate this to have another one, and this time around I'm going to have a password field. I'm going to call this password, then the type is going to be password. So we're not doing anything special, it's just to be able to show you the form and for you to see the difference, how it's different from your normal regular forms. Bootstrap has done a nice job in styling this for you in such a way that you can have this good, nice view. You can also have the same feature for text area. So text area allows you to enter multiple lines. So we have this same feature available there. And it also has come with this its own look. So without having that form control, this is what you end up with. So you can see the difference from the regular text and what Bootstrap has done for you. So Bootstrap allows you to control the size of your input elements. Your form control allows you to control the size of the form, because sometimes it might be too big for what you are trying to use it for. In case some places in your web page you want to make that form very small, maybe sometimes in your navigational button on top you want to reduce the size of the text box, and this might be too big for it. You want to use something small. Bootstrap has something that will help in that, and that's called form control SM. So form control SM makes it smaller than the regular one you have there in such scenario. And if you are trying to also capture something very big, you want to stress on that input box, you can do LG. We see this in a very prominent website where you don't have a lot of forms, where you just have username and password. So you want to capture the user attention to focus on the text box alone. So in that case, you want to provide a very large text box. So that's why you will have those effects there. And you can also be creative and put this form inside a grid in such a way that you can have a row like this and have each of the elements in those rows or in the column, so to say. So you could have something like this, where this could be a column auto, meaning it should not really focus on a particular size. Depending on which one is larger, the system can just decide on what to do. So here, let's demarcate this so that we have a straight line. And here you can say you want the label to actually be this, meaning the first thing that will show here should be the label. Let's put a space in between what we have. So I want to use another name. This will be email 2. That's for email 2. And you want the content of the next column to contain the email information. So you can see what you have there. And this time around, you will specify email 2 so that once you click here, you can go ahead and put your email right in there. And the last thing you want to specify there, and this is just preference anyway. So last thing can just be maybe a text that specify a note on what to do. Let's say this should be your valid email. So this can be in a span, and then you can style this to your taste. Or you can do muted. You can style this to your taste. I think we can also do some alignments to align. You can see that all the items are aligned to the top. You could actually do something like this to align it to the center. So that way all your text are aligned to the center. So I'm sure you can already imagine what you could achieve with something like this. So you could do, for example, now you could do another column, and this time around you are specifying password from the user, and then we can specify password here, and here you could do, okay, so you could either do, there are so many ways we can pull this off. Since this is a multiple column, we could take this off, and let all the column be inside a single space. Like we could just move all this inside here so that all the column could sit together, and we can go and use row codes to determine how each of the column will fit. Row codes, so we could do something like this, and we do G3. So this is looking way better than what we did. So this is an example of how you could pull something like this off, with what you've learned so far, because we've learned grid system before. So you could see how you could implement that to also put that inside your form and do something like this. The next group of elements that we have is select. In select, we don't use form control, we use something different. So let's go ahead and first build our select option. So we'll say red, green, and yellow. So this is how our select box looks like without doing anything. The class to add to a select element is called form select. So immediately you add form select to your selector, you have something like this, which is way nicer than where we are coming from. So this is way nicer than this. It's way nicer than this. So we can implement Bootstrap by just adding form select and it will all look good like this. The same thing, you can have different sizes for different forms, and to maintain such size you can just add form select. Apart from the fact that you set form select, you can then specify how big it is, if you want an LG or you want a small version of what you have there. So as I've said, there will be some instances where you don't want your form to be this big, you just want it very small. So you could do this kind of scenario. So if you want it normal size, you don't need to specify any of the sizes. And then you have this, what we call a helper class, an information that tells more about the element. So they are more of like tips to what the user wants to capture. And even though we use text muted and small to capture this information, Bootstrap already have something in mind on how to capture information like this, and that is called form text. So you are telling it that it should be a text within a form, so you can have that in place of small and text muted. So that will always show at the bottom of any form element that you have. So let's give it a try here. Let's say we have span, and here we say, apart from the fact that we would have had a label, so let's have a standard label so that you see the difference of everything that we have there. Let's have a standard label here, and this label is supposed to be for this ID, and this ID is called select1, so that we can now properly say that this label is for this select1. Then we'll say select color. So this is the label, this is the element, and finally we can then say at the bottom we want to add an helper class or something that we better explain what your choice should be like, what should influence your choice. So I can now say choose your best color. So you can see the way it is, it's contending with what you have here already. There's a conflict because here is a label and also here is a helper class that is supposed to be something different. And how do you differentiate the two things we have here is by specifying the helper class that is gonna be like a tip for the form element, and that's gonna be form text. So you can see the way it's different from what you have here, and it's a little bit smaller and nicer. So you can use that to explain what the user is supposed to enter here, because your label is supposed to be short and precise. And under here you can go as much detail as you want to. I call them checkbox and radio box. Check and radio box. How are they done? So let's start with check first. So a typical check will look like this. Let's go ahead and first define how a typical checks will look like, so that we can then see what makes it different. What are the things that we're adding to it that makes it different? So you can have your label, and your label can be, let's say, check me, and I'll have the second label say check me not. Each of the label will have an input box. So the first input box will be like so. The type has to be checkbox, where you then specify the ID. We'll call it check me, and you have to tie it to the label and say for who, for check me, so that when you click on the check me, it activates that information. So this is the first label. The second label, I will just copy it and change the name. So I'll just copy this and call this check me not, and I have our not here. So it depends on how you want your checkbox listed. You might want it inline or separate. So let's make it clearer and have our div to do the demarcation, just like a container, so that we can have it like this. So this is a standard way of having our checkbox and label. What does Bootstrap bring to the table? How do we implement Bootstrap to it? So in the container that is holding checkbox, we have to have a class called form check. That is the first requirement in what you have to do. You have to call it form check. The container that is holding both the input and the label has to be titled form check. And then you can see the second one, the way it's looking. So the difference now is that it has added a padding to the font. That's nice. So let's move on to the next thing. Your class for your input has to be this. It has to be form check input, so instead of your form control that we have for normal typical text box. In this case, you have form check input. That's what you have here. That's the requirement, and then you can see the difference. You can see the way it glows compared to when it is your normal checkbox. So there's a difference with Bootstrap checkbox and your default HTML checkbox. The last thing we then need to do is the label. The label also needs to look cool. So in the class for label, you can guess it. It will be form check label. So even though there's no visual difference, you just have it there in case there's a future update. You can be able to style that section like that, and it will give you, any effects that must have been inherited. So that concludes what that is. Very easy. It has 3 classes you need to focus on: the form check input, and the form check label. We can repeat the same thing to the one on the bottom and we'll get the same effect. Again, you can span your label in rows and columns so that it will be properly presented in the way you want it. So let's move on to the radio. So let's duplicate what we have here and call the first one checkbox so that we can do our radio. So the second one will be titled radio box, and you will know that there's similarity between the checkbox and the radio box. I will just do a quick renaming. There's no difference. You still maintain the same theme in terms of the same name we've been using, form check. There's no form radio, so it's still form check that you're going to use to denote that. But what I'm just going to do is I'm going to have this repeated here and here so that you can see the difference in what you have there. Not done anything special. We just duplicated the first checkbox and put it under radio box. What we want to do right now is to change the type from check to radio. After we would have done that, we need to change the ID because there's already an ID called check me and check me not. So we change those 2 types to radio me and radio me not. So we have that. The other thing we need to do before this check will make sense is that they need to bear the same name. Remember how radio box work. All the radio that you want to group together have to have the same name. So I'll just call it radio, and the other box has to be called the same radio so that they will now know that they need to toggle within each other. That's the requirement. So we've not done anything differently. The same thing we did in checkbox is the same thing you're going to do in radio. So what are the new class that was introduced? We have form check, we have form check input, form check label. That is all. Something new, which is switch, and you've seen it all over the place on phones. Once you see the interface, you get to know what I'm talking about. So switches are like checkboxes because checkboxes maintain either checked or not checked. So switches are also, is either you switch it on or you switch it off. So there's no HTML element for switches. Since there's no HTML element for switches, you can use CSS to trick the browser and make it look like a switch. And since you have the closest thing that looks like a switch is a checkbox. So Bootstrap has given the ability for checkbox to be converted into switch. So since we have two checkboxes here, I can actually convert them to switch. So what I will do is I will title this here to say checkbox or switch. Then how do I convert this to a switch, for example? Quite easy. What I just need to do is to add a new class inside this part that says form check, form-check, and I'll do form-switch. It's as simple as that. So immediately I do that, I have this kind of effects, which is very beautiful. So mobile devices use this to switch in between, to toggle between yes or no, enable or disable. So it's the same thing like checkbox yes or checkbox no. So but is more appealing in mobile devices. Just to implement it, you just do this and then you do form-switch and you have it implemented for any device that you're looking at, any checkbox that you're looking at. So this can only be implemented on checkboxes, by the way. And the only thing we had to do was to add form-switch and you have this beautiful effect. So let's go ahead and add more options to what we have on the bottom. I want to show you how to do inline. Obviously, the checkboxes we are having here and the radio box are being viewed in a block element, meaning you have your options in a block element. Check me cannot, is on top, and check me not cannot be by the side, based on the default view of how radio box and checkboxes are defined. Let's now say we have a third option here, which is tied to no option, radio no option. So I'll call the last one here and say, I'll call this and say no option. So how do you make these three items stay in line, meaning they should stay side by side with themselves? Quite easy. You will just come to this part here. Each of the section, we have three checkboxes. You have to indicate on each of the container holding the checkbox or radio box. This also applies to checkboxes. So you just come to the container and you specify form check -inline. So when you do it to the first one, you don't see the results because the second one is still blocked. So once you implement the second one, you then start seeing results. What happened now is the second one and the first one are both inline, they stay on the same line. The third one needs to also comply by adding inline to it. So you have this neat view of item in inline position. This can also be applicable, or you can apply this to your switches or your checkbox by doing this and that. You now have them in this view. You can now have them in this view. So if you want inline options, you could have it like that by just specifying form check inline input group. So let me document that right here. So you ask, what is input group? This is a combination of an input box or an input element with a text element combined together in such a way that you could have the item complement each other. They could stay side by side to each other so that there won't be space in between those texts and then the input box. And this is very useful if you want to have a label joined together with the input box in such a way that you can't separate them, and that way it gives the notion that those items are grouped together or they are single elements. So let me give you guys an example. How do you do this in Bootstrap? So what we want to achieve is to have an input box with a label at the end giving us an email address, and the idea is that we want to be able to enter an email without adding the extension, the domain name. So that's the example we want to demonstrate. So ideally, if you want to have that kind of feature, you will have an input box an input box. We already know this. We already know the form control at work. And the next thing is where we'll have our arts. Let's say domain name. And of course, you want to have this inside the span. Remember what you are trying to achieve. What you are trying to achieve is such that our domain name will be placed at the end of our input box. So I just present it literally like this so that you can see how we can get to that point from this angle. So first thing first, they need to be inside the same container. They need to be in a container, because that way it allows you to control the flow of the content inside that container. After you must have done that, the next thing is to provide a class, as directed by Bootstrap, and that class is input group, meaning your intention is to make sure that all the items inside the container are combined together, are joined together in that form. So immediately we provide the input group class, you can see that it's trying to do something like that. It's joining the text control with the label or with the span elements, but it's not neat, as we were expected to be. And that's because we've not properly styled our label or our span. So let's give it the style that it's supposed to have. As far as Bootstrap is concerned, the style is supposed to be input group text. Input group text. And then you can see the results that we have. So this makes a lot of sense. This kind of control is very important for where you don't want user to be repeating maybe a particular domain name, or you don't want them to repeat an information at the end. In this case, you can say they should put their email address, and since you are collecting an email address from a specific domain, we could so that they can just enter their email address like so. So let's see another example. I'll just duplicate what we have here. In this case, let's bring the domain first, to come in the front, and you see the kind of example that I want to demonstrate here. So you can see by just switching the span, it changes the orientation. So if I'm asking you to enter like a domain name or an extension of a domain that you want, or to enter your website, I can already say your website is supposed to have HTTPS and it's supposed to have www. Then you are supposed to then go ahead and say mydomain.com. So this gives you relieve the user from entering this other information. So depending on how you intend to capture these details, so it's left to you. You can allow your imagination to go wide here and bring up as many kind of example or as many use case as you can think of. But the most important thing is that they have to be in a container, and that container has to be input group by name. The next thing is you have to specify that the addition that you're adding to the element has to be input group text. Let's say you want to add, this time around, you want the static content to be in the middle. So we can do something like this. You want this to be in the middle, and you want another text to be in the beginning of what you're doing. So you can have something like this and say, let's say you want to create a domain name or an email address. Then I can say my email address should be let me say Michael. Then the art is working well based on what's supposed to be just be a label. Then this one can be at processguy.ng. So this can be an example, and you can have as many labels as you want. You can have a label that starts and end. So let's do another example like that. Starting label and an ending label. So you can have a starting label, and this can be in form of another example can be maybe a currency, can be a starting label. And here you can allow, let me even put a placeholder so that you can see what's happening there. So obviously placeholder is just for you to see what text that you can enter. Then the next thing I want to capture is just to say that I want you to capture a whole number. So I can just do that number there, like there. So you don't need to, when you're putting your number, if you do something like this, you don't need to do .00. You've already estimated that input at the end. So you can just let your imagination, work here and come up with as many things as you can come up with. You can have as many complex input text as you want. So you can add more text, and you can have as many form control as you want. And finally, it also works for text area. So if this is a text area, so it works for text area. So it also works for, this is using text area. We could have line break to create this kind of effect. So it's working for text area as well. So in all this, you could also specify the size of each of the input group elements that you have here. So let's say if you wanted this to be a bigger input group, you go with LG. So and then you get to see it, in this size. And of course, you could go small size, SM. So you can see it's smaller than the rest of all the ones you have here combined. From the fact that we could add a text inside, you could actually add another control apart from text and input element. So you could actually have buttons there. So here that you have this text, you could have it as a button. So let's go and get this and replicate what we have on the bottom here. And this is very good example if you want to do a search button. For example, if you want to do a search, we could replace this entire section. Let me just comment it out so that you see it visible, and we can just go ahead and put our button right there, and we can name it search. So obviously, because we didn't style it, it's not looking nice yet. So let's give it Bootstrap button effect, which is denoted by btn. And finally, we provide a form of outline so that we'll have a line across. So we have btn outline. You can choose any of the outline properties there. So we have primary, it will give it this blue effect. You have danger, it will give it a red effect here. So outline just allow it in such a way that is the red effect that will go around it. That's what the outline is. If you do not use the outline, it will fill the text with the color that you specify there. So if you want the text to remain transparent or to remain the default color, you just need to specify the outline. We will talk more about this later. In fact, you can combine it with any element you want to. There are various things you can do with this. You can convert it, you can add it to select box, for example. You can add checkbox to it. So as long as you follow the procedure that we have here. So this part can be a select box, for example. So this part can be select, for all you know. It can be a select box. And then you have this label serving as a way to receive input for this. So this is a very nifty way to do this. So the guideline for you here is to know that the container that contains all your elements that you want to put together has to be inside, it has to have a class called input group. Then if you are passing a text, it has to be input group text, so that the system will know how to put your contents. Every other thing will just follow inline, will stay in line with it. For example, your element, which is the form control, will stay in line with the next element that happen to show. So you have a button here. If you keep having more buttons, they will keep putting themselves, in that order, so that you have a control that is grouped together. Up next, we have floating labels. You could actually make a label float within the input field, and this is a very nice effect, as you would have seen them in mobile devices. So we'll quickly do something like that, and you'll see how easy it is for you to deploy. First of all, you start with your container that will hold both the label and the input box. So the first requirement is that we have our input box starting first. Very important, your input have to start first. And we can specify the type. Let's just say text. And our class, we already know how to do this, is going to be form control. Up next is we have a placeholder that can be tied to username, and we can have our ID because we're going to be using a label, and call it user un for username. Then we bring in our label, and our label is going to say for username. Then our label will then be username there, and you can see from the output our label is appearing after. That's fine, you get to see where the magic comes to play. So you already know what this is doing. So the new thing that we're introducing is a class, and that class is called form floating. We can see our label is inside. So once you take your mouse and try to click, you get to have this nice effect. Your label floats on top. So that was achieved just by adding a class called form floating. So we can do that for another one. We can do another quick example, and this time around we can do password. So let's do password, and this can be username, can be password, and our ID can be pwd. Our ID can be pwd here. Then we say password. So immediately you take your mouse here, you can enter your password, your username, that's process guy, and your password can be whatever thing that you want it to be. And apply this to text area. We can apply it to select, and you will have the same effect like you just see here. Me adding it to select, and you can see this is a disabled option. I can remove disabled label attribute, so you can see a floating label on top. So you can also add it to text area. So we can change this one to text area, for example. And the requirement is that it's supposed to be form control. Then the ID just to have a similar ID. So you can see the floating. So this could be address. So adding the placeholder, we have something like this. Once you click, you have the address showing up there. So we've been using buttons lately, but this is officially going into buttons. So you could actually convert an anchor or a button, that's anchor element or a button element, into a Bootstrap button. To do that, let's use an anchor so that we can use, since an anchor is not a button, but we can convert to the button. So it gives us a very easy way to explain what we want to do. And the anchor we have is normal href. We're going to use the two examples at the same time. So I will just say a button, and that's how it looks like. And I'm going to create another one on the bottom, and this time around it's going to be called the normal button that you're used to. And I will say this is the button. So this is the default way that button renders. And if you want the nice cool effect that Bootstrap has to offer, you have to add the class, which we are used to. So the class to make a button feel like Bootstrap button is by adding btn. That's the short form for a button, btn. Immediately you do that, it carries the default, the base style of what a button should look like. And we can do the same thing to our a tag. Immediately we specify that to an a tag, you can see that both of them are now looking the same just by inputting the class btn. And that's not the end. What this does is to initiate the default view of your button, and that's the base class. We now have other classes that we can add to it, and these other classes gives it variants, of colors of how the button should look like. So how then do we know the variants? Remember that we have like 8 colors in Bootstrap. We have our primary, we have secondary, success, danger, warning, info, and light, dark. So how do you then invoke these colors into the buttons? Is by doing btn dash any of these colors. So we could do dark, and then you can see your Bootstrap button showing in black. Then for this one, we could do btn and do primary, and you can see your button showing in that color. Other things that we want to also show apart from this feature that you have here is what we call outline. What outline does is that it takes the color of what you are working with and it uses it as a border. So let me go ahead and display another example, but this time around using outline. So it's by adding outline dash your color. So you have btn outline dash the color you want to use. So it can be warning, or let's use danger. So you have that effect right there. So you can see the difference between outline and solid. I'll call this solid. So this is the solid way. So this is the default way you have the button. But if you want an outline whereby the color that you are looking at is now the one that is surrounding the border of the button, we just add outline to the text, and then you have this effect. Other things that you also have that a button can do for you is you can increase the size of the button, like how big the button should be, and that can be done by using btn dash the size of what you want to increase it to. So you have SM and LG. So if I do LG there, notice that the button now becomes bigger than usual. Then if you do btn dash SM, it becomes smaller than usual. So those are the two forms of sizes you have. You have the normal size, the bigger and the smaller size. Up next is how to make a button responsive. So what that means is that at some point you want your button to take a full width of the entire screen, or you want it to take some section of the screen. How do you implement such kind of thing? You could use the grid system. because Bootstrap comes with almost all the display property. You have the D for display, and we've talked about inline, we've talked about block, we've talked about the block. We've used that a lot. We've used inline as well, and now we are going to talk about the grid. So the grid allows you, just the way the grid works in normal HTML, it allows you that any item that is inside the grid, it will be displayed in form of a column. So let's go ahead and see how to implement that. So first of all, I can have two buttons here just to demonstrate. This will be the items, button 1 and button 2. So this will serve as the item. And within that, they need to belong to a grid system. So I need to wrap them around a grid element. So, and we said to specify an item that is a grid, you then need to do d-grid. Automatically you have this effect, but you can see that you can manually, or you can adjust the width of this by specifying the gap in between the grid, and that can be specified by using the class gap and the number of gaps you want to implement. That will give you that gap, and this is responsive depending on what you want to implement. If you will notice this in login page on some websites, whereby you will notice a very big button that allows you to log in or sign off. What if you want it to have a different effect on different part of the screen? So let's say by default, if it's very large screen, it shouldn't look this obvious, or it shouldn't look this funny, because if you are using a very large screen, you don't want to have a display button that is this large. How do you then do something like that when it's a very large screen? Is by coming to this place and specifying that when the display is empty, what should happen? It should actually block, meaning it should block each of the items. So that's what you do, that's what happens there. But when it gets too small, it will automatically turn to a manageable, sizable grid, just like this. So this is how you implement this kind of feature. Assignment. I think you guys should be able to do Facebook login page. So take that as an assignment on this course. Thank you for staying to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on bell notification in order to be notified when we release new videos. See you in the next one.